this video, we're going to be talking about perpendicular lines. So take a look at these 6 sets of lines I have. They're blue, red, green, black, purple, and orange. Can you recognize which ones are perpendicular? Which ones? If you said the red ones, you're right. Because perpendicular lines are lines that intersect at a right angle. Perpendicular lines have slopes that are opposite reciprocals, and if you have 2 slopes and they're opposite reciprocals, you know that it's perpendicular lines. But also, if you multiply their slopes together and you get -1, that's also a way for you to be able to tell that the lines are perpendicular. Let's look at an example here. So in this first example, we're going to determine which of these lines, if any of them, are perpendicular. And we have 3 lines here that we're looking at. We have line A, or I guess it's little a, line A, line B, and line C. So because we were given a graph and we were given points on the graph for each line, we can find their slopes. So remember that slope is the rise over the run. So we can take a look at line A, and we see that we have a point here and a point here. So we can rise up, because remember we're always moving from left to right. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're moving up 6. So again, we're going to go up 6 and then over. So now it's our time to run. So 1, 2. So we're going to run 2. We'll put our 2 there, and we see that that's going to reduce to the number 3, or 3 over 1, right? Let's take a look at line B. So now if we look at line B, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move my points here so we can look at B. At line B, our points are here and here. And if I'm moving from left to right, I'm not going to rise, but I'm going to fall. 1, 2. So I'm going to fall. So -2. So -2 over, and now we're going to run till we get to our other spot, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're going to run 6. And when we reduce that, that is going to give us a -1 over 3. So now let's take a look at line C. So we'll go ahead and we'll get rid of our marks for line B. And let's look at line C. So here we have points marked here and here for us. It's going to move left to right. I'm going to go up first. So I'm going to rise 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to rise 5. Then we're going to run 1, 2. So we're going to run 2. And that doesn't reduce. That's just a 5 over 2. So as we look at these, we see a couple things. Here, we can see that these slopes are opposite reciprocals. Because if I take my 3 over 1 and my 1 over 3, I can flip-flop them, making them reciprocals. And because one is positive and one is negative, that makes them opposites. Thus, they're opposite reciprocals. So I can say that line A is perpendicular to line B. Now, if I was having trouble identifying if it was an opposite reciprocal, then what I could do would be to multiply those slopes together. So I would take 3 times a -1/3, and when I multiply that, I'm going to get the value -1. And remember, we talked about that if their slopes multiply to a -1, then they're perpendicular. And so here we see that when we multiply our 2 slopes together, we got the -1, making them perpendicular. Let's look at another type of example. So here, we're not necessarily going to be determining if lines are perpendicular, but what we are going to do is determine the perpendicular slope that we would need to make the lines perpendicular. So in this first one, we're given that the slope is -3. So we want to know, what would be our perpendicular slope that we would need? So we can write -3 as -3 over 1. And so in order to get the opposite reciprocal, the first thing that we're going to do is look and say, okay, is this positive or negative? And here we see that it's negative. So our perpendicular slope will be positive. Then we're going to flip-flop, so 1/3. And so this would be our perpendicular slope for part A. Now, part B is a little bit tricky because here we have a slope of 0, but that's technically a 0 over 1. So here we're going to have an undefined, because if I were to flip this, it's going to put the 0 on the bottom, which you're not allowed to have. Can't have that. So we call that undefined. And it can't be positive or negative, it's just going to be undefined. Let's take a look at letter C. So here, looking for our perpendicular slope for letter C, we're going to flip-flop our 5 over 1, or 1 over 5, and make it a 5 over 1. And because this one was positive, that means our perpendicular one's going to be negative. So we're actually going to have a -5 over 1, which reduces to just a -5. And that's going to be our perpendicular slope for C. So this one was for C, B, and A. Now, take a look here so you don't get confused. Letter D says that the M is undefined. Now remember that our perpendicular slope for 0 was undefined, which tells us that that means that our perpendicular slope here is going to be a 0, because those are reciprocals of each other and they go together for perpendicular. So that's letter D. And then for letter E, when we have the 4, that's like saying 4 over 1. So if we look for our perpendicular slope here, we're going to need to flip those and make that a 1 over 4. And this one is positive, which means our perpendicular answer is going to need to be negative. So -1 over 4. And you can always double check these simply by multiplying your original slope and your perpendicular slope. And if you get a -1, that means that they're perpendicular.